Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. It's Rabbi Akiva Males, and today is Wednesday. It is the 3rd of August, and we're going to get ready for Parshas Devarim, which is also known as Shabbos Chazon. This is the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, and that's called Shabbos Chazon based on the Haftarah that's going to be read. I want to start today by sharing something incredible with you. We're going to connect 3 dots. We're going to connect Rav Kook. Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook Zatzal was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi in British Mandate Palestine, later to become the state of Israel. We're going to connect him with his Rebbe, who was the Nitziv, the great Naftali Tzvi, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin of Volozhin, and then the son of the Nitziv, who was Rabbi Chaim Berlin, who was the chief rabbi of Moscow for a number of years. We've all heard of the yeshiva called Rabbi Chaim Berlin. That's named after Rabbi Chaim Berlin, who was the chief rabbi of Moscow for close to a quarter of a century. We're going to talk about that. So let's make this connection. So let's see on the sheet the source sheet. I've got it up here on the screen. Source number 1. There's a brief bio about Rabbi Chaim Berlin. Rabbi Chaim Berlin, you see that he was born in 1832 in Volozhin, passed away in 1912 in Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. He was the chief rabbi of Moscow from 1865 to 1889, that's close to 25 years. He was the oldest son of the Nitziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda of Berlin. When he moved to Yerushalayim at the end of his life, he continued to teach Torah and inspire Jews there. He was one of the Rabbeim who Rabbi Aryeh Levin, Zatzal, the famous tzaddik of Yerushalayim, felt very, very drawn to. He was a very close student of Rav Chaim Berlin. I'm going to share with you something from Rav Chaim Berlin that I chanced upon the other week, and let me just show you how. The other week, Shabbos afternoon, I shared with the shul before Mincha. I shared a shir based on a fascinating tshuva, a beautiful responsa that was written by Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of British Mandate Palestine, as we said. Rav Kook, this was a beautiful episode that was brought down in the sefer called Moadei Haraya. This goes through the holidays, the seasonal cycle with Rav Kook, and has many Divrei Torah from him, as well as different episodes in his life that his Talmidim recorded. And one of the episodes that was in there was the subject of our shir last Shabbos before Mincha. And that was about a fascinating psak, a ruling that he had given concerning the 9 days. In a nutshell, there was kitchens that were set up in the early days of the state of Israel, before it was a state, where pioneers and new immigrants could come and get a meal. And they most of them were not kosher. Most of them were not keeping Shabbos. So the Paulei Mizrahi, the workers' movement of Mizrahi, which was the religious Zionist faction within the Zionist organization, the Paulei Mizrahi said there was a serious need. They set up kitchens throughout Israel, away from the big cities. It wasn't necessary so much in Yerushalayim, but out in the fields and out across the country where work was being done to build up the land of Israel. Paulei Mizrahi set up kosher kitchens where people could come and get a good, nutritious, hot, kosher meal. But it was more than just a meal. It was a bastion of ruchnius, of Jewish spirituality. There would be shiurim. There would be public Torah learning that would take place there. There would be social events. There would be zemiros on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. There would be singing. There would be dancing. It was a place to get an infusion of Yiddishkeit. So it was more than just nourishment for the body. It was nourishment for the soul. And the big concern was, one more important detail. Things were hopping at these kitchens and these dining halls. So much so that people who were not observant, who kashrus did not mean anything to, said that's the place to be. So people who were not observant started coming to these dining halls as well. And they were having the opportunity to eat kosher food and to get this infusion of Yiddishkeit into their system. So the question came up before the 9 days of Av, what do we do with these kitchens? There was no replacement. At that time, they didn't have access to any type of parv nutritious meals. They needed their protein for these workers who were slaving away and being exhausting physical labor. So they needed their protein, and they just didn't have anything that could supplement that wasn't fleischiks, that wasn't meat or chicken. So they didn't know, what do we do for the 9 days? And nobody thought there was a solution. One of the leaders of the movement, a man by the name of Mr. Mavrach, he decided he was going to go consult Rav Kook. And it was a beautiful account of how we finally made it to Rav Kook, and all different ideas got shot down. Someone was suggesting, why don't you make a siyum every single night? And he said that might work in Yerushalayim, but we've got all these kitchens that are dining halls spread out around the countryside. We don't have Talmidei Chachamim who could come out there and make a siyum every single night. So what do we do? So Rav Kook Paskin, he wanted to hear the question, and he said, tell me one more time, if you shut down these kitchens for the 9 days, would people who had started, the non-religious who started coming there to get a kosher meal, and based on your assessment, would they go back to the treif kitchens and eat non-kosher? And he said, absolutely. So Rav Kook Paskin, he said, in that case, if that's the truth, and if that's the role that your kitchens are serving, when you're serving your fleishik meal, it is a sudas mitzvah. We think of a sudas mitzvah as a bris milah, a pidyon ben, a siyum on a mesechta. Rav Kook said that's a sudas mitzvah. You're taking care of achenu b'nei Yisrael. You're taking care of other Jews who would not eat kosher food, and you're providing them with kosher food and a Jewish environment. That's a sudas mitzvah, so they could eat the fleishik meals. So Mr. Mavrach asked, he goes, okay, I could hear that about those non-from Jews who didn't care about kashrus. We're saving them from eating treif. They could have the kosher meat meals. But what about the religious, the people who are not going to go eat treif? Could they eat as well? And Rav Kook said, yes, this is a sudas mitzvah. Just like by a siyum, we say everyone who's in attendance could participate and eat fleishiks. This is a sudas mitzvah, what you're doing. You're enabling other Jews to eat kosher. That's a sudas mitzvah. You're infusing them with Yiddishkeit and Jewish spirit. That's a sudas mitzvah. So therefore you can eat, not only can they eat the fleishiks, but everyone present could eat as well. They're part of a sudas mitzvah. This Mr. Mavrach records this in a very dramatic fashion. And he said, again, he qualified it. He says this was really a limited psak based on the times and the circumstance of what we were dealing with in the 1920s. But it's a fantastic story, and that's what he brought down. So I shared this with the show before Mincha and Shabbos. It was very, very beautiful. But here's what I did not have time to get to. At the end of that piece in the footnotes, there is a beautiful piece, because Rav Kook was touching upon in this ruling, he was touching upon the obligation that we have, how beautiful it is for Jews to care about their fellow Jews who are not as observant, and try to do whatever we can to bring them closer to Torah, to Yiddishkeit, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to infuse Yiddishkeit into their lives. So on that theme, look at this footnote. I found a beautiful footnote. It says, Urei Tshuva Shel Hagon Reb Chaim Berlin. Look at a famous response that came from Reb Chaim Berlin. Now, again, I didn't see this tshuva. I didn't look it up. I didn't have a chance to look it up if it's brought down in the responsa of Reb Chaim Berlin, but here's where it is brought down. Rav Menachem Mendel Parush. It was publicized by Rav Parush Besifro Betoch HaChomos. This is a sefer that he wrote in Tafshin Ches. I believe that's 1948. So he wrote on page 171 the following ruling from Rav Chaim Berlin. Asher Shol, the question was raised. B'mi she'ein banav nohagim kishura b'America. Here's some pious European Jew. His kids went off to the United States of America in pursuit of better living conditions and to make a living, and they're not behaving appropriately, meaning they are not observing Torah and mitzvahs. However, in as much as they are not observant, they respect their father. So here's a pattern that's developed. Whenever their father comes to spend time with them, they're nervous about honoring their father. So what do they do when their pious religious father visits? They close their businesses on Shabbos. If the father would leave them, if the father would say, I want to pursue greener pastures, there's such a life of ruchnius in the big city or in Israel, and why should I stay with my good-for-nothing kids? They're living in a midbar. They're living in a place where there's really no strong Jewish infrastructure. I want to be where there are yeshivas. I want to be where there's more Jewish life is more robust. But one second, but when I'm with them, they keep their stores closed on Shabbos. So he says, Vimachi parade miyam, if the father would leave them to pursue a more robust Jewish atmosphere, yiftechu eskeyam b'yom HaShabbos b'parhesya, they would publicly open their businesses on Shabbos. Is the father required to stay with them, even though he could leave them and enrich his own life by living in a very robust religious atmosphere. Look at this question. The question's coming to Rav Chaim Berlin, and you can just feel the pain. Here it is. This is the waves of Jewish immigrants who are coming to America where there is no religious infrastructure, the end of the 1900s, beginning of the 20th century. And here is the parents, here's the father, he's distraught. He says, Nebuch, I visited my kids. They're not keeping kosher. They're not keeping Shabbos. And I'm so sad about it. But here's what I noticed when I came to visit them. They respect me, and out of respect for me, when I come, they close their business. They won't publicly violate Shabbos. When I come to lead kosher, they're not going to bring chazer into the house. So what's my responsibility? I want to leave. Ugh, I'm disgusted by this. It's a midbar. I want to leave. I want to be in a more robust, a more rich Jewish environment. But am I obligated to give that up in order to stay here to prevent my kids from being mechalel Shabbos? That's the question that comes to Rav Chaim Berlin. Look at his answer. Here was Rav Chaim Berlin's answer. If this elderly father, if he's secure about himself, that staying in America is not going to drag him down. He's committed to Shabbos. He's committed to kosher. Staying there, will it be more difficult? Yeah, he won't have a choice of restaurants and pizza shops, kosher places. Will he have shiurim to go to? No, he won't. He's going to have to learn on his own. He definitely, his life in America will not be as spiritually enriched, but he will not slide into sin. He's convinced of that. Even by staying with his kids and staying in America in a place that does not have a rich Jewish environment, will he be able to prevent himself from sliding into sin? If that's the case, however, by doing so, he's upset, his soul aches. He can't become the full Jew that he wants to be because, again, there's no shiurim going around. He's not living in a very outwardly Jewish neighborhood. So if that's the fear, at least chazik b'limud Torah, he won't be able to learn as much as he would like to. He won't be able to develop his own spirituality as much, but he's confident he won't slide into sin. With tefillah aguna, he also won't be able to have proper prayer because he's not living where they're in close proximity to a proper shul, and he doesn't have the great kavana tefillas that he would have elsewhere. If this is what's going on, that he himself will not slide into sin, but he just will not be able to develop into his full spiritual capabilities. His obligation is to give up on his own ruchnius, and not be concerned about the fact that by staying there with his kids, his own Torah learning and his own divine service will be lessened. He has to be more concerned about trying to redeem his kids. That you don't want to push a stone after someone who's already fallen down. That's a Talmudic concept. They've already fallen. Don't make it worse. They're having a terrible time. So what? You're going to leave them now? And now they're going to completely fall apart. Since God knows that this father's intent is totally for the sake of heaven, he's trying, by staying there, he's trying to save his kids from being public Sabbath desecrators. God will recognize what he's done and will consider it meritorious. God will consider him like one who is trying to benefit the masses. That the merit of the masses all is hinged on him, and therefore he will be compensated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What a beautiful teshuvah, what a beautiful idea that Rav Chaim Berlin is saying. Again, it's hinged on the fact that the person's not going to slide into sin. If this person is nervous that he himself is going to fall apart, unravel, and start living a life of sin, get out of there. Go to a rich Jewish neighborhood. But if you're not worried about that, if what you're worried about is just, I'll be a Jew, I'll be a good Jew, but I could have been a great Jew had I lived in a solid, frum neighborhood, my davening would have been out of this world. My learning, I could have chavrusas and shiurim around the clock. If that's the fear, stay with your kids. Because by staying with them, you're going to save them from Chilul Shabbos. If you're confident you could do that, That's what God would want from you. Give up on your own ruchnius. Give up a bit on your own ruchnius to save the next Jew. That's what Reb Chaim Berlin was telling this person. Fascinating. And it's a beautiful idea. And again, but it's totally contingent on the beginning that says that he was confident about this father, was confident about himself, that by staying there, he would not slide into a life of sin. He would be fine. He just wouldn't be able to take it from good to great. That was the scenario. Now, I want to show you, this is a beautiful, beautiful idea from Reb Chaim Berlin, but I want to relate it to something that his dear father, we said that Reb Chaim Berlin was the son of the Netziv, the great Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. And I want to relate this to something in this week's Parsha that his father, the Netziv, has. It's a very, very famous idea. And I want to share this with you. It's beautiful. And we'll compare and contrast. You'll see where it fits exactly with it, where it's synonymous, and where it might differ a little. So in the Parsha this week in Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu is reviewing with Bnei Yisrael their national history. He's reminding them what were the high points, the low points of the last 38 years or so that they spent in the wilderness after they left Mitzrayim. So in going through all of their trials and travails, their ups and their downs, Moshe Rabbeinu reminds them about this idea that as we approached Israel and we got to the land of Sichon and Og, so we were not supposed to stay there. We were going to march over the Jordan River, go right into Israel. And then Sichon and Og, they started up with us. They went to war against us and God was with us. So we conquered them. And now we've got all this land on the east side of the Jordan. So two Shvatim, Reuven and Gad, approached me saying that they have massive amounts of cattle, sheep, and flock. And this is an Eretz Mikneh. This is an incredible pasture area. So let us stay here so we can take care of our animals. And that's what Reuven and Gad asked. So let's see the psukim. After Sichon and Og went to war against us and we beat them, so we possessed all this land. He gives the description of the borders of the area that they conquered. Yud Gimel. There was a huge amount of land I gave to half the tribe of Menashe. And he tells you exactly where that is. Then Yudalad tells you about Yarib and Menashe. What did he take? The land that he took. In Tesvav, Machir was also a son of Menashe. What did he take? And then back in Tezayin, verse 16, back to Reuven and Gad. So he tells you what he gave to Reuven and Gad. All the commentators are bothered by the following idea, and it first shows up at the end of Parshas Matos, which we just read the other week. Two Shvatim approached Moshe Rabbeinu about staying on the east side of the Jordan, Reuven and Gad. You do not read in the psukim that any members of Menashe approached Moshe saying, we want to stay on the east side. You don't find it in the psukim. Yet what happens when Moshe calls them together, Moshe Rabbeinu calls Reuven and Gad together, he includes Chatzi Shevet Menashe, half the tribe of Menashe. So we always say it was 2.5 tribes that stayed on the east side of the Jordan. It was all of Reuven, all of Gad, and Chatzi, half of Shevet Menashe, half of the tribe of Menashe. Where did that come from? The psukim don't indicate that anyone from Menashe asked to stay there. Where did this come from, that Moshe all of a sudden starts coming up with this deal for Reuven and Gad and Chatzi, Shevet Menashe? Here's what you need to do in order to stay on the east side. You've got to send your warriors to be on the vanguard, to lead the effort, the battle against the nations that are living in Canaan, because we don't want to do anything that may demoralize the Jewish people to think that the reason you don't want to go in is because you're scared. Where did Menashe get caught up in this? Why is Chatzi Shevet Menashe there? And there are various answers to this question, but you should be aware that it's asked by all the commentaries. And again, it first shows up at the end of Parshas Matos, which we read last week, because that's where this all appears. But now Moshe's repeating it. And again, Moshe says here that 2.5 tribes stayed behind, Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe. But here the psukim say, not only did Menashe stay behind, half of Menashe stay behind, I gave them a huge tract of land. The Netziv is going to be bothered by what's going on here. First of all, where did Menashe get into the mix? And second of all, it was only half a tribe of Menashe. Why did they get so much land? Why did Moshe give them so much? Those are the questions that's bothering the Netziv. Let's see, here's just a brief bio on the Netziv. You see that Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, he's known as Netziv because that's the acronym of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. So again, that's the acronym. And again, you see the years of his life was 1816 until 1893. And again, we first saw the tshuva, the response from Rav Chaim Berlin, who was his son. So Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, these are the questions that he's bothered by. Well, first of all, where did half of the tribe of Menashe get involved? How'd they get into the mix? And second, why is Moshe giving them so much? They're half a tribe. So in the Nitziv's commentary to the Chumash, it's called Hamak Davar. On this week's Parsha, you'll see where he deals with this. And it's incredible what he says. Let's read it together inside. So I'm on page 4 in the handout. So at the top right of the page, again, the piece began on the previous page in this Chumash, in the Chumash of the Netziv, but it wasn't really necessary. It was the question. The question is, again, where did Menashe get involved and why are they getting so much? So let's see the end of that first paragraph. Here's what you have to say. There's a real deep lesson here, a deep intent. Moshe was trying to give an important lesson over to the Jews who chose to stay on the east side of the Jordan. Venira, it appears as follows. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to sense that the Torah and the ability to observe the Torah and its influence on Bnei Yisrael who were going to stay there was going to be minimized. There's a mystical connection between the land of Israel and the Torah of Israel. The Torah was given to Bnei Yisrael. We're a people who are supposed to be in Israel. The Torah is supposed to be in Israel. The Torah is supposed to be observed in Israel. There's a special segula. There's a special force that makes the most appropriate place to be living a life of Torah in the land of Israel. And now you got Reuven and Gad who are opting to stay on the east bank outside the borders of Israel. So Moshe Rabbeinu was able to sense that the ability of the Torah to impact them and their ability to connect with the Torah is going to be somewhat minimized because they're living outside the borders of Israel. He goes, and I wrote about this earlier. B'Shem Avos de Rabbi Nosson, he quoted a medrash, Al-Kain, therefore, Moshe made every effort, lahashtil b'kirbam, to instill in their midst. I've got to give you an infusion. I got to do something for Reuven and Gad to make sure they don't fall off the wagon. So what did Moshe do? Lahashtil b'kirbam, he wanted to instill in their midst, Gidolei Torah, Torah giants, sheya'iru, mechoshchei haaretz ba'or koach shalem, that they would, these are people who are giants of Torah, living, observing, learning. I want them living in your midst, and they will do their best to try to bring you up to speed and prevent you from falling off the wagon. So Moshe recruits half of Menashe. Menashe was so stark, they were so solid, they were so committed to Torah learning, to Torah living and observance. It was contagious. It was coming out of them. Moshe says, I need some of you from Shevet Menashe to stay on the east side with Reuven and Gad, because I need you to infuse your excitement of Torah, your excitement of living and learning and living a life of ruchnius. I need you to give that over and to impart that to Reuven and Gad. He recruited them. You will enlighten them from the darkness of this land outside of Israel with your light and your excitement of Torah. He writes in Shoftim, he says about Machir Yardu Mechokekim, is that Machir was from Menashe. They came from Mechokekim. They were the ones who set the rules, meaning Hainu Gedolei Torah Rosh Yeshivas, that Machir was amongst the giants of Torah and the leaders of schools. Like it says also in the Gemara, like it says in Bereshis, what does it mean, mechokek? Someone who's the lawgiver. The people who were the mechokekim, those are the lawgivers, those are the ones who were so closely connected with the Torah. They were so excited to transmit Torah, to teach Torah. So that they existed within Menashe, as he proves from the pasuk in Shoftim, that from Machir, who was from Menashe, there were Mechokekim. So therefore, Moshe recruits them to be with Reuven and Gad. And we also learn in Yevamos, the money Machir, Gam, Cain, Hayim Shevet Yehuda, that those descendants of Machir, they also had some of the Yehuda genes in them. Hainu Zera Yar ben Menashe, Hayim Ibnei Yehuda. There was, in other words, their mother's side of family was coming from Yehuda, like it says in Divrei Torah, Shaya ben Shagum, and Chetzim ben Peretz, Ayin Lalan, fine. The Ishtadel Moshe. So what did Moshe do when he's recruiting these Torah giants to come live on the east side? Ishtadel Moshe sheyitzratzu hema l'shavas be'bar Yarden. These people are so drawn to Torah. They're drawn to Ruchnius. Moshe has to make a convincing deal to make it worth their while to give up living in Israel. They want, if there's anyone who wants to be in the land of Israel, it's those people who are so closely attuned to Torah because they understand the divine connection that exists between Torah and Israel. So Moshe says it's not going to be an easy sell to ask members of Menashe. I need people like from Menashe to live with Reuven and Gad to keep them from falling off the wagon. But how am I going to convince them? It's hard. They're so ruchni. They're so spiritual. They want to be in Israel. So the Netziv writes, he says, Moshe has to give them a deal. He has to make it worth their while, that they would be willing to live outside the land of Israel. That's why Moshe is giving so much land to Chatzi Shevet Menashe. It seems out of proportion. That's what they asked for. They weren't willing. He's asking for volunteers to live there in the midst of Reuven and Gad. No one's taking it. He says, I need Torah giants. They're saying, we don't need this. We want to be in Yerushalayim. We want to be in the land of Israel. We don't care. So Moshe has to up the ante. He has to offer a huge tract of land in Ever Yarden. Finally, that'll convince them. Bachis of Yerushalmi, you see a hint to this in the Yerushalmi, Bikurim. Rabbi Yossi, Agli Yomer, Meviam Bikurim Ever Yarden, that we don't bring the first fruits from the east side of the Jordan, because we're only supposed to bring first fruits that grew in the land of Israel proper. Mishum dechsiv, because the pasuk says Eretz Zavas Chalavu Dvash. It says that part of the speech that they give is that it's a land flowing with milk and honey, and these are its fruits. Below Ever Yarden, the other side of Jordan was never described as that. Honey, but then the Gemara says Asher Nasata Li Hashem, Lo Shenatalta Li Me'atzmi. So there's another opinion that says that no, I'm also saying this is the land that God gave me. It's not land I took on my own. What's the difference between them? The difference is the half of the tribe of Menashe. Are they able to give this speech and bring Bikurim? According to the opinion that says the only thing that prevents you from bringing Bikurim is if it's a land that you took on your own, as opposed to what God said you're allowed to have. So Chatzi Shevet Menashe lo nalu be'atzman. The half tribe of Menashe, they didn't take this on their own. They were asked. Volunteers were called for. Take this land, please. We need people to look after Reuven and Gad, and they stepped in. Perish lo natlu kimal yidei bakashas Moshe. Half the tribe of Menashe, they never asked for this. The Torah, again, never recorded that Menashe asked to be on the east side. Moshe asked for volunteers. So therefore, Mistama Asal Pi Hashem. If Moshe asked for volunteers, that means it was coming from God, because Moshe doesn't turn right or left without God's permission. So therefore, they could still bring Bikurim. This qualifies. Is that Asher Nasata Li Hashem? They could still say it. So that's the difference. In other words, according to the opinion that says you can't bring Bikurim from Ever Yarden, if it's based on Eretz Zavas Chalav Udvash, yeah, you're right. Even the half tribe of Menashe can't do it. But if the reason you can't bring from the east side of the Jordan is because Asher Nasata Li Hashem, so that's the difference. Then the half tribe of Menashe could still bring, because they qualify under Asher Nasata Li Hashem. But again, the Netziv is saying these are all proofs to my approach. The half tribe of Menashe, they never asked to be there. They didn't want to be there. Moshe asked them to be there, and he had to sweeten the deal by giving them a huge tract of land. Now we understand what happens in this whole episode. Moshe is now reminding the Jewish people, I started dividing up the portions here to figure out what was going to go to Gad, what was going to go to Reuven. But I couldn't complete the process until I could get requisite volunteers from Menashe. The Gamar Imam, and I was able to clinch the deal with them. Finally convinced them to move over, but I had to give them a really big piece of land. Only once those leaders, committed Torah Jews from Menashe agreed to settle there, only then was Moshe able to close the deal with Reuven and Gad. Now I feel confident leaving you on the east side of the Jordan when you have these Torah giants who are going to live in your midst. All of Bnei Yisrael knew this at that time. Everybody knew this at that time. So Moshe is now repeating this, what happened in Parshas Matos. Moshe is repeating this for them about why did Menashe end up there? It's because I wanted Torah giants in your midst. Moshe is teaching them a lesson, how important it is to live amongst Torah observant Jews. Because you were going to live on the east side where there was going to be the spiritual weakening, I had to take Torah giants and convince them to live with you. What's he doing? He's trying to drive home a lesson, what he bolded here. And from this, we're supposed to learn for all generations. That Jews should always try to live in a place of Torah, where there's a Torah infrastructure, where there's something to support me in my efforts to be a Torah Jew. I don't want to be that one salmon who's swimming upstream. I need a supportive group. I need a supportive atmosphere. We're human beings are not so strong to be able to go it alone. We're not Avram Ivri, each and every one of us, who can say the rest of the world, be darned, I'm going to do what's right. We're all influenced by our surroundings. So let's recognize that and let's pick our surroundings and let's find a group. Let's find a supportive group to live amongst, that we're in this together. We're going to put our shoulders together and we're going to commit to observe Torah together. That's why we form shuls. That's why we create day schools, to create an environment that's supportive of Torah. This is what Jewish life and Jewish destiny depends on. That's what the Netziv is writing. That was the lesson of Chatzi Shevet Menashe. Kenisa b'Ksuvos, and he says this, the Gemara in Ksuvos fits well with this. Kashem she'asar latzes me'eretz Yisrael Bavel says, just like it's forbidden for a Jew to leave Israel and go to Bavel to live, because that would be a diminishing of a Torah environment. Kachasar latzes me'Bavel l'chutz la'aretz. If a Jew is already living in Bavel, which had a strong Torah environment, they shouldn't go live in another part of Chutz La'aretz, which has a weaker Torah environment. Perish Rashi, Lefi sheyesham yeshivos hamarbitzos Torah tamid. In Bavel, there were yeshivos that were teaching Torah. Even when it comes to burial, Chazal says over there, shetovli covered b'makom Torah, kamo b'malas Eretz Yisrael. Even when it comes to something like choosing burial, it's better to be buried in a place of Torah. Someone could say, okay, I understand why I have to live in a place of Torah. Why do I have to be buried in a place of Torah? The Gemara says that's important as well. Moshe Rabbeinu taught this lesson to Bnei Yisrael by doing what he did. What a powerful, powerful idea. So here's the Netziv reminding us how important it is to live amongst like-minded people, live in a strong Torah atmosphere. And that's what we do. That's why we try to create a Torah atmosphere. No, I've seen people, we've all seen people who say, okay, I'll have a house miles and miles and miles away. And for Shabbos, maybe I'll come and spend it there. You know what? If the person does that every single week, that's beautiful. But we've all seen people who say, okay, this Shabbos is not going to work for me. I'm going to stay out on my ranch. It's harmful. I need to be in a supportive environment. I need to be, so the people who do own that Shabbos house, so they could be, that's awesome. That's why they're doing it. So they could be amongst like-minded people. It's so hard to keep Shabbos by yourself. But when I'm around like-minded people, it becomes so much easier. But I got to make sure to stick with that. I don't want it just to be, okay, I have that Shabbos house and now I'm going to forget about it. No, use it. We've all seen people who have done that and it's worked marvelously for them. It also means when we're picking where we want to live in strong Jewish neighborhoods. That's what we want to do because will reinforce one another. Let's take this back to Rav Chaim Berlin. Does this look like it's a stira? Does it look like it's a contradiction? Here's the Netziv. The Netziv is writing how important it is to be amongst other Jews, and we can't give that up. Rav Chaim Berlin told that father who had the kids who were not keeping Shabbos in America, and the father wants to go back to Israel or wants to go back to Russia, to Europe, wherever it was, and live in a strong Torah environment, the Nitziv the Chaim Berlin rather told him that no, you should stay. Is it a contradiction? I don't think so. I think they all agree. The Rav Chaim Berlin told the father, if you are so strong that you will not slide into sin, then you should stay. If all you're worried about is that you won't be able to have the sprinkles on top, in other words, whatever, to take it from good to great, but you can still save them from sliding into sin, you should stay. If there's a fear you yourself are going to descend into sin, Rav Chaim Berlin wouldn't allow the person to stay. And I think that fits with what his father, I think that fits with what the Nitziv was saying here. The Nitziv was explaining that Chatzi Sheva Menashe were Torah giants. They were not going to descend into sin. Would their ruchnius have been better in Israel? Of course it would have, because Israel is misugol, Israel is opportune for the Torah. But he told them, okay, diminish some of your status so you can help Reuven and Gad. You can help them from descending into the abyss and from leaving the Torah. But Moshe Rabbeinu didn't pick Jews who he thought might be at risk themselves. Moshe Rabbeinu picked Chatzi Sheva Menashe because he saw these are Jews who are not going to slide into sin. Would their Torah lives be enhanced by living in Israel? Of course. Were they giving up something by being on this side? Yeah, but they were going to try their best to strengthen themselves. I think they fit hand in hand. What the Nitziv was saying here in this commentary to the Parsha, as the same as what his son, Rav Chaim Berlin in Moscow, was saying to that father staying with his kids in America. I think these are powerful lessons for each and every one of us to think about and ask, where do we fit on the scale? Am I someone who can be so confident about myself that I won't fall into sin? I don't know. I'm not ready to say that. I want to have Jewish company. I want to have Jewish neighbors. That doesn't mean my next door neighbor has to be Jewish, but that means I want to live in an area. I'm a close walk to other Shabbos observing Jews. I'm a close walk to shul. I'm around other people. I live in close proximity to stores where kosher food is readily available. If I've got to drive 30 miles to buy kosher food, now it's going to become a nisayon. It's going to become very tempting when I'm not in the mood to make that drive. So I want to position myself where I'll have the most chance for success. And the way we do that is by living amongst like-minded people who are committed to Torah, mitzvah, observance, living, and learning. That's what we want to do. And that, I think it's beautiful. At the same time, if I know I'm not going to fall into sin, and it's a question of giving up a little of my ruchnius, not by sinning, but just my growth in order to help others so they don't sin, Rav Chaim Berlin says that's important, and it might be your responsibility. We've got to know ourselves. We got to know if we're strong enough to do that. But if we are strong enough to do that, we have to think about others. I think this is absolutely beautiful, and that's what happened with the Menashe. What his father taught, how his father explained what happened with Menashe. I think it's beautiful. Fits like a glove. I want to end with one quick thought. I saw a beautiful idea from Rabbi Reisman, Rabbi Yisrael Reisman in Brooklyn. I heard him say this a couple of years ago, and it fits like a glove. We're all getting ready to observe Tisha B'Av. There's still another day or two that hopefully Mashiach will come and there won't be a Tisha B'Av, but in the event we have to observe Tisha B'Av, we're going to get ready for it. And that's why tonight I'm going to run a review before Mincha. I'll have it on Zoom, so I'll record it. I'll send it out if anyone can't make it. I want to share with you something beautiful I heard from Rabbi Reisman. Look at the bottom of sheet 4. So there's the Mishnah in Maseches Tanis tells us, Chamisha Dvarim Iru Es Avosenu, Eru Es Avosenu B'Shivas B'Tammuz, Chamisha B'Tisha B'Av. There were 5 national calamities that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. That's why we fasted close to 3 weeks ago. And there were another 5 national calamities that occurred on Tisha B'Av. What are they? So I bolded B'Tisha B'Av. What were the 5 on Tisha B'Av? Nigzar, number 1, Nigzar Al Avosenu Shliach Konsul Aretz. The adult generation of males, after the sin of the spies, the Meraglim, the Gezerah, the decree came out that they would all die in the wilderness over the next 38 years, the next 40 years, they would not enter the land of Israel. That's tragedy number 1. That was Tisha B'Av when the decree comes out. B'charav Bayis V'Rishona V'Shnia. Tragedies 2 and 3 is that the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash were destroyed according to our tradition on Tisha B'Av. Those are tragedies 1, 2, and 3. What's number 4? V'Nilkada Beitar, the city of Beitar, which was a huge bastion of Torah Judaism after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and we were beginning to see maybe we could reorganize. The Bar Kokhba revolts were kind of taking place, and that was destroyed by the Romans. Tens of thousands of Jews were massacred. Number 5, V'Nichra Shaha'ir. And then the Romans came and they plowed up Yerushalayim and the Temple Mount to demoralize us further and say, give it up. There's not going to be a rebuilt Beis HaMikdash. Those are the 5 tragedies that occurred on Tisha B'Av. Again, that didn't happen the same year. The Beis Hamikdash wasn't destroyed the same year as Beitar, and that when it was plowed up, those were in subsequent years after the Bar Kokhba, the failed Bar Kokhba revolts. So the Mishnah concludes by saying, Mishenichnas Av Mematin B'Simcha. Based on that, that's why when the month of Av rolls around and we're in the 9 days, that's why our joy is diminished. So here's a beautiful idea from Rabbi Reisman. He shared this in one of his Chumash Shiurim a couple of years ago. I think he said this over in the name of Rav Moshe Shapiro in Eretz Yisrael, but I'm not 100% certain. We say every time we bench the following idea: Rachem na Hashem Elokeinu. We ask God to have mercy. Number 1, Al Yisrael Amecha. Number 2, Al Yerushalayim Irecha. Number 3, on Jerusalem. So the first was Al Yisrael Amecha, your people, Israel. Number 2 is on Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, your city. Number 4, Al Tzion Mishkan Kvodecha. Number 5, Al Malchus Beis David Mishichecha. I'm sorry, that's number 4. And then it was V'al Abayis HaGadol VeHaKadosh Nikra Shimcha Alav. And lastly, on the Beis HaMikdash that you put your name upon. Isn't it interesting? We're asking God to have mercy on 5 aspects. Number 1, Al Yisrael Amecha, your people. Number 2, Yerushalayim. Number 3 was Tzion Mishkan Kvodecha. Number 4 was Malchus Beis David Mishichecha. And number 5 was Abayis HaGadol VeHaKadosh. So Rabbi Reisman pointed out, and again, I think he quoted Rav Moshe Shapiro in Israel, that he says these 5 correspond to the 5 tragedies of Tisha B'Av. Every time we bench, we're asking Hashem, we recognize the 5 biggest national calamities we suffered in the month of Av, and why we say Mishenichnas Av Matim Simcha. We're asking you to remember them, have Rachmanas, have mercy on us, and reverse them. How do those fit? Number 1, look at that again. Rachem na Hashem Elokeinu al Yisrael Amecha. God, remember your people, your your nation, the Jewish people. What was the first tragedy that the Mishnah told us? That it was a Gzeira al Avasinu Shali Kansu Laaretz, decree on our ancestors and all the on that generation of Jews that they were going to die in the wilderness, that they wouldn't enter the land of Israel. That corresponds to Rachem, have mercy al Yisrael Amecha. Number 2, what was the second tragedy? Harav Bayis Barishona, the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. That's why we say Val Yerushalayim Irecha. That was when Yerushalayim was at zenith. The spiritual heights of Yerushalayim was never higher as it was during the first Beis Hamikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built. That's when the Luchos, the Aron was there. God's full presence was palpable in Yerushalayim. So we're saying, God, have mercy on Yerushalayim. Bring us back to that point where Yerushalayim was at its zenith. Number 3, Val Tzion Mishkan Kvodecha. Bring us back the full glory of Tzion. What's that? So he says that's Bayis Shnia. That's the second Beis Hamikdash. It was incredibly special, but it wasn't as special as the first because we didn't have the Luchos, we didn't have the Aron, we didn't have the Ark in the second Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, even though we had the Beis Hamikdash, the full Shechina, the full divine presence wasn't there. So it was great, but it wasn't as special as the first Beis Hamikdash. That's why it's not referred to as Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was at its zenith in the first Beis Hamikdash. At Tzion, it's still incredibly special, but it wasn't Yerushalayim. What's number 4? Val Malchus Beis David Mishichecha. That corresponds to the Churban of Beitar. What happened? That was the failed Bar Kokhba revolt. They were trying so hard to reestablish the Malchus Beis David. They were trying so hard to reestablish the Davidic dynasty, and it failed. And tens of thousands of Jews were massacred in Beitar. And finally, Val Bayis Hagadol Hakadosh Shenikra Shimcha Alav. And finally, what was the 5th tragedy? Nechra Ha'ir, that the Romans came and they plowed up the foundations of Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash. They were trying to demoralize and saying, give it up. There's never going to be another Beis Hamikdash. And to that, we're saying, we're asking for that 3rd Beis Hamikdash. Hashem, have Rachmanas on us. Remember those 5 tragedies that the Mishnah recounts for us that occurred in the month of Av. And why we say Mishenichnas Av Mematin B'Simcha, when the month of Av rolls around, that we diminish our joy. And we're begging you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, every time we bench, Rachem, have Rachmanas on us. Remember those 5 incredible national tragedies and reverse them. So we can also reverse what that Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, Mematin B'Simcha, we long for the day when our full sense of joy, our full sense of Simcha can be restored and we can be fully happy once again. That could only occur with the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, with the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash, with it being rebuilt, and the restoration of the Malchus Beis David, the Davidic dynasty being restored, which will happen B'Yemos HaMashiach. May that day come soon. And God willing, again, we still have a couple days. May we not have to observe Tisha B'Av in mourning this year. And if we do have to, may it be the last time. with this, we're going to conclude. I'm going to